So, with the new age kind of stat boom in the NBA and all this talent that's coming in recent years and just completely making things crazy in terms of a box score perspective, the MVP race and races for all the different kinds of awards in the NBA, they're just going to get harder and harder year in and year out. But I decided that before the 25-26 season gets going, I'm going to give out a couple of my really sneaky MVP award predictions. And when I say sneaky, I mean really James Bond stealthy because you wouldn't really see these guys coming, but well, some of them in certain instances, but most of these guys on the list, they would be guys that many would perceive as not having a chance. But I, on the other hand, am an equal opportunity employer, and I think that all of these guys that I have listed have somewhat of a sliver of a chance based on their specific situations and the narratives that are involved with them and their teams. I think for those reasons, they're going to have a chance at coming away with the MVP award. All right, so how I'm going to do this is I'm going to have three guys from the Eastern Conference and three guys from the Western Conference that I have as my sneaky picks for the MVP. And a lot of it's going to either have to do with their individual stats as being the main framework of their argument, or their team record or their perceived team record if their team gets to a certain threshold in the playoff standings. That's really going to that's what's going to encapsulate my argument. So, first guy on the list, we're going to start with the Eastern Conference, and we're going to go from sneakiest to the least stealthy. That's how we're going to do things here. The first guy on the list for the East is going to be Jalen Brown. So, of course, with no Jason Tatum, that makes things very interesting for the Boston Celtics in 25-26. But if a guy like Jalen Brown, if the team can rally behind Jalen Brown, a guy that's already proved to be their kind of 1A player in the postseason and already got a Finals MVP, if he can have a statistically great regular season, and we've already seen him reach heights of about 27 points a game, 7 rebounds, and he just got to a career high 4.5 assists this past year. If all of that can come together, if Jalen Brown can have a huge scoring lead, maybe he gets to about 27, 28 points per game, mix that with 7 rebounds and 5 assists, and if he's still a pretty great defender at all levels, there is a chance that if the Celtics end up capturing maybe a top 3 or 4 seed somehow, if Derek White and Anthony Simons and Peyton Pritchard and Nemias Queta can rally behind Jalen Brown and they just have a phenomenal regular season, there's a chance that Jalen Brown could receive some MVP buzz. And even if that's the case, it's very unlikely that he actually comes away with the award, but at least he can make voters think about it. And the biggest part of that is just the fact that he's had that experience before as being a guy that's essentially led the Boston Celtics to an NBA championship. Of course, Jason Tatum, you could argue that he was still the main catalyst of their 24 run specifically, um, but even though he had the low percentages. But Jalen Brown, time and time again, has been their postseason kind of alpha, if you would like to categorize it like that. They're 1A. So if he could just put together a pretty great statistical regular season and mix that in with the Celtics, maybe eclipsing 54 wins or somewhere around there, if they just have an excellent season out of nowhere when nobody's expecting it, then he'll be in the talks. And he'll have that narrative based kind of thing where it's like, oh man, Jason Tatum's going to be out the entire year, and now Jalen Brown has really taken over, and now he's the main guy on the Boston Celtics. And that can cause a lot of perceived dissension in the locker room, and the media would take that and run a mile with it, if not a marathon. So that's my first pick for a really, really stealthy, really sneaky MVP candidate in the Eastern Conference. And now we're going to move to a guy that he would reach these kinds of talks from a statistical point of view, um, purely in past years. But if he can put that together with good team success, it'll be much of the same thing. And that's Trey Young of the Atlanta Hawks. And again, we're talking about a guy that's reached individual levels of basically 30 points a game. He reached 29.6 points per game one year, scored 28 points per game another year on pretty decent efficiency. And just this past year, got to 11.6 assists, which led the league and was obviously a career high. So, with the way that the Atlanta Hawks were able to reshape their roster, and now that they've surrounded Trey Young and Dyson Daniels and Jalen Johnson with and Zachary Risachet with guys like Porzingis, and you brought in Nikhil Alexander Walker, who's going to probably be one of the more underrated free agent signings of the entire offseason, and Luke Kennard as well. You just gave Trey Young so much more three-point shooting around him that you can hit Kristaps Porzingis on pick and fades routinely. You'll have Nickeil Alexander-Walker in the corners, and he's able to create off the dribble for himself a little bit. But in terms of assists for Trey Young, you got Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who's going to be putting up at least 3 to 4 catch and shoot threes per game off of Trey Young assists or feeds. Then you got Luke Kennard, who statistically is one of the greatest three-point shooters of all time, still in his prime, getting up catch and shoot looks purely from Trey Young assists or looks. So when you have all that in mind with the way that the Hawks were able to reshape their roster and that they could be positioned to capture a top 3 to 5 seed in the Eastern Conference, if Trey Young can get to the 28 to 30 point per game mark again and possibly even lead the league in assists again, and I think it's without a doubt he'll reach the 11 assist figure this coming year, though it may be coupled with 4, 4.5, close to 5 turnovers a game. I do understand that. But with Trey Young, he can get to 30 points and 10 assists easily and put in 4 rebounds. He's always been good at steals and passing lanes, as guys at his size typically are. If he gets to maybe 1.5 steals, which isn't a figure that it's a figure that he's gotten close to, he can again receive real MVP buzz. And that'll be the narrative too, that, the Hawks just came out of nowhere after having a great offseason, and Trey Young was really able to put it together and lead this reshaped roster to a great playoff seed. So Trey Young, if he gets to maybe a 30 point, 11 assist mark, and the Hawks are fantastic, he will certainly be in the conversation for MVP. And finally, we're going to close it off with one that's obviously the least stealthy, maybe the most obvious and in your face, because he's been a top 3 MVP vote getter, a consensus top 3 finisher in MVP voting for the past 3 years running, and that's Giannis Antetokounmpo. But the reason why I say that he's a sneaky candidate is because you're going to have guys in the West like Luca, like Shea, like Jokic that are going to put up the counted stats necessary year in and year out to warrant MVP consideration. You'll have those guys putting up 33, 12, and 10, or 31, 11, and 9, and things like that. They'll have the stats. And Giannis will have the stats too, but the way that he jumps in to this conversation is again team success. And I know that, and this is actually to Giannis's benefit, team success has become less and less of an integral piece of a player's MVP candidacy. We've seen guys, and it really started in 2017 with Russell Westbrook when his Thunder were a 5 to 6 seed, but because he was the first guy since Oscar to average a triple double, they gave him MVP and he led the league in scoring and all that. So he kind of broke that mold of the main argument being, well, he's got to have the stats and his team has to be at least a top 3 seed in the conference. No ifs, ands, or buts. The team has to be a winner. So this was then continued with Jokic winning his one of his 3 MVPs when they were like a 5 seed. And if Giannis can have a similar kind of season where he's putting up, let's say, 32, 12, and 10 on 60% shooting, something that like no one had ever seen before, and the Bucks somehow were able to capture a top 4 spot in the Eastern Conference, it might as well be wrapped up for him, because the narrative for Giannis, and narrative is going to play a big factor in all of these candidacies. The narrative for Giannis is that he's all alone with no Damian Lillard. Of course, they got Miles Turner, but Miles Turner is not a sufficient number 2 to Giannis, so it'll just be him backpacking this Milwaukee Bucks team like never before. And really, on an individual standpoint, that can lead to a higher assist figure for Giannis. Maybe he gets up to 8 to 10 assists per game because he's really going to act as their point guard. That's going to be the crux of the argument for a guy like Giannis, because he's really going to be able to put up the counted stats on fantastic efficiency. And if that leads to wins somehow for a Milwaukee Bucks team that lost Dame and that it seems as though NBA media is really taking a dump on this past offseason, he can shock the world and win his 3rd MVP award. And I don't really think that that's too crazy, but it's a lot more sneaky than, again, the main guys, and mostly in the Western Conference, like the Lukas, the Shays, and the Jokic's of the world. And with that being said, we will move to the Western Conference's sneaky MVP candidacies. And these are a little bit more obvious, but that's just because the talent in the Western Conference is just on such an elevated level compared to the East, that the guys that are sneaky would really be top candidates maybe in the Eastern Conference. But with that being said, I think the least sneaky, or the most sneaky, I should say, the stealthiest MVP candidates or potential candidates are. We'll start with. I have three guys that they're kind of on the same playing field, but if I had to choose, I would maybe go with Anthony Edwards. Yeah, we'll say Anthony Edwards. Um, and that's gonna just come from the fact that his team didn't really do too much to complement him with new pieces and things like that. Of course, they lost Nikhil Alexander Walker to the Atlanta Hawks, so that's really I feel like people don't value Nah as much as they should. That's going to be a huge hit to that team. People don't understand the kind of value that he brought to Minnesota, but that's besides the point. Anthony Edwards being surrounded with the same kind of team, the only choice for him really is to just continue to level up individually if the Timberwolves aren't going to provide him with more of scoring punch in terms of a star caliber teammate that you could bring him. Of course, Julius Randle is a guy that's a former multiple time All Star, was an All Star, I believe, this past year. Was he an All Star? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But a guy like Julius Randle isn't necessarily going to cut it. And though they made the Western Conference Finals and Randall had a great postseason up until the Western Conference Finals, it just might not cut it. So Anthony Edwards is going to have to think to himself, man, the only way that I can possibly get this Minnesota Timberwolves team to leapfrog over the Houston Rockets and the Denver Nuggets and a plethora of other teams is I have to just go berserk individually. And of course, he has the past couple of years, but not to the effect of he's going to be a clear-cut MVP candidate. If he can really show the world that he has fully arrived as a guy that you can't ignore in conversations like this, if he averages 30 points a game and ups the assist figures and just becomes a better playmaker with better vision, better feel for escaping double teams and figuring out where to go from there, then he's going to be a player that you can't really ignore. And of course, if he keeps up his defense and he makes, let's say, an all defensive team, then he's going to be a guy that you can't ignore. But I feel as though he's going to be the least or the most stealthy out of these guys just because of the team situation, that his team didn't necessarily get better and he's not really going to be put in a position to contend with the Lucas and Jokic's and Shea's. Mostly because his team got to the sixth seed this past year, and it was a dogfight in the Western Conference. So really, all the teams were like on the same playing field except for the Thunder. But if the Timberwolves have a chance of making the play-in tournament, and we've seen guys compete for MVP even though they've landed in the play-in tournament before, it's just really going to decrease those chances and basically nullify him as a candidate. But I do have some like sliver of hope for Anthony Edwards in that regard. But moving forward, the next guy on the list, I will say, is Steph Curry. And I don't think that maybe it's crazy for some people to believe that Steph would have a better chance of winning MVP going into his age 37. He'll be 38 in March season. I'm just saying it purely based on the fact that he's been there before in this decade. He's been there before, and he's finished top 3 in MVP voting, and he's a guy that consistently is in the top 10 in MVP voting year in and year out. But the real crux of this is the fact that Jimmy Butler is now a Golden State Warrior, and we saw very visibly how Jimmy Butler's introduction to the rotation completely rejuvenated Steph. And we could see that in the pre and post All Star numbers for Steph, where pre he was averaging maybe 23 points on very lacking efficiency for his standards, maybe 43% from the field, 38 or 39% from three. But once Jimmy Butler got in the door, that immediately flipped around and he was averaging 27 points on 48, 41, 95 splits. And the Warriors went, I think, in the 24 games post All Star break, they went 19-5. So Steph is going to have his opportunities with a full season, his first full season with Jimmy Butler at his side. There's a chance that, and this is according to basketball reference projections too, that he could reach maybe 27, 28 points a game, 6 or 7 assists, 5 rebounds. And if he shoots over 42 or 43% from three, he's going to be a guy that you can't ignore. And the narrative for Steph is going to be ridiculous, that he's returning to that kind of level and he's going for his third MVP. And especially if the Warriors are right in the thick of things with the Nuggets, with the Rockets, with the Thunder, who they proved to be competitive against last year when they had a full squad. It's really, really going to be something to see how Steph comes into this year and whether he's got the gas to put up 27, 28 points a game for a whole 82 game season. But I think he's still very much in condition to do so. And he said himself that he's far from done. So he's the second guy on the list. He's kind of in the middle as a guy that's still obviously a very sneaky MVP candidate because there's still those top three guys in the West out there, but a guy that could be someone that you can't ignore because he's had that previous success. He's already a two-time MVP and a legend in the game, so he could get sympathy from voters simply because of that. But the final guy, the least stealthy guy of the three that I selected in the Western Conference, will be Victor Wembanyama. And that's because it's not improbable that the San Antonio Spurs completely flip things around and win 50 plus games. And the narrative, of course, for Victor is that he's finally arrived after winning Rookie of the Year and almost being, he would have been Defensive Player of the Year runaway, in my opinion, in his rookie year. But they just didn't give it to him because he's a rookie. And then he would have won it in his second year if he didn't miss half the season. So coming into this year, especially if he's let's say he's the most dominant player in the NBA on both sides of the floor, and the San Antonio Spurs eclipse 50 wins with a full season of Fox and Wemby together. And if Dylan Harper has a Rookie of the Year type run, and Stephon Castle builds on his previous Rookie of the Year type run, there's just so much room for the San Antonio Spurs to really assert themselves as at least a top five team in the Western Conference. And if the Spurs can get there to that kind of level in the standings, and Victor gets to a point where it's 28 points, 12 or 13 boards, 5 assists, 1.5 steals, and 4 blocks on good efficiency, that's going to be a guy that you can't ignore for the next decade. And that's just really going to put up his hype for this season as being, just the first of many MVP award wins. And I don't mean to say that team success will be as big of a factor as it is, but it always is. And even though it's gone down, it's been a little bit less of an effect on your actual MVP candidacy in recent years. It will still definitely be a huge factor, but the Spurs are in a position where they're not just gonna potentially win big this year, but again for the next half decade to decade at least. So we're hopefully going to see big things out of Victor, but hopefully we'll see him play more than the 65 game requirement. Excuse me, that's necessary to win NBA awards. But anyways, that'll be it for me today. Thank you very much for tuning in today's video. And if you want to stick around and hear me talk about more basketball, please consider hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Also, leave a comment down below. Do you think any of these guys are actually going to have a chance to win MVP in 25-26? Let me know. Also, turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos. All right, that'll be it for me today. I will see you guys in the next one. See ya.